honestly. Not the tragedy of the villain who falls, not the tragedy of the hero who fails, the tragedy of the person who never had a chance, who was placed, by birth and circumstance, in a position that was designed to be impossible, and who lived out the consequences of that impossibility. Across 50 years without ever quite understanding why everything kept going wrong. Henry VI of England was born on December 6, 1420, in Windsor Castle. 9 months later, he was King of England. 2 months after that, he was also King of France. He was 9 months old. He could not speak. He could not walk. He could not, by any definition of the word, rule. What followed across the next 50 years was not, strictly speaking, Henry's failure. It was the failure of a system, a monarchy that had placed everything on one man, and then given that man a disease, a constitution, and a set of political circumstances that made competent rule essentially impossible. Henry VI didn't fail England. England had been failing Henry VI since the moment of his birth. He died on the night of May 21 to 22, 1471, in the Tower of London. He was 50 years old. Whether he was murdered by order of the king who imprisoned him, or whether he simply died of grief when he learned that his son had been killed in battle 3 weeks earlier, the historical record cannot definitively establish. What it establishes is this: he died alone in a prison in the building. That was supposed to represent royal power, and the death was convenient for enough powerful people that nobody looked too carefully at the details. This is the story of the most unlucky king in English history, and it is a story about what happens when the wrong person inherits the right position at the wrong moment. Part 1. The father who cast an impossible shadow. To understand Henry VI, you have to understand Henry V, and specifically, you have to understand what Henry V built and what Henry VI inherited. Henry V died on August 31, 1422, at the age of 35, of dysentery contracted during military campaigns in France. He died at the absolute peak of his power and reputation. He had won Agincourt. He had conquered Normandy. He had negotiated the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which recognized him as heir to the French throne and regent of France during the mental incapacity of Charles VI. He had married Catherine of Valois, the French king's daughter. He had, in 5 years of sustained military and diplomatic effort, achieved what generations of English kings had tried and failed to accomplish: a legal claim to rule both England and France simultaneously. And then he died, leaving a 9-month-old son, an achievement that he himself accomplished. This created was of a child king. Medieval Europe had managed child kings before, through regency systems that could maintain governmental function for the years before the king reached majority. The specific problem was that what Henry V had built required not just governmental function, but active military leadership. The French were not going to accept English dominance because a legal document said they should. They were going to fight. And fighting required a king who could inspire soldiers, make strategic decisions under pressure, and present the personal credibility. That military command in the medieval period absolutely required. A 9-month-old king could not do any of these things. And by the time Henry VI reached an age at which he might theoretically have done them, something had gone wrong that made them impossible in a different way. Henry V as a father. Henry V had been almost entirely absent from Henry VI's life. He was on campaign in France for most of the period between his son's birth and his own death, and his direct relationship with the infant who would inherit everything he built amounted to almost nothing. There are no documented accounts of father-son interaction beyond the most formal ceremonial contexts. This is not a personal criticism of Henry V. Medieval kings did not structure their lives around their children's emotional development, and he had kingdoms to manage. But it is relevant to understanding Henry VI's formation. He grew up without a father, in a world entirely around his father's achievement, by men who were managing that achievement and managing him as its symbolic embodiment, with no one providing the kind of direct paternaling that might have prepared him for what was required of him. The man who most directly shaped Henry VI's character and education in the early years was his uncle Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, a scholar and patron of the arts with genuine intellectual interests, but limited political, no military brilliance. Henry VI absorbed from Gloucester a love of learning, a piety that became central to his identity, and a preference for peace and negotiation. 422, and his assumption of personal rule in approximately 1437 was conducted by a regency council whose internal dynamics would have undermined any king, let alone a boy with no political instincts and no powerful personal authority. The two formal protectors were John, Duke of Bedford, Henry V's older brother, responsible for the French campaigns, and Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, responsible for domestic governance. The relation was the most functional element of an inherently dysfunctional system. Both were capable men who understood their respective responsibilities, and they generally did not interfere in each other's domains. The less functional elements were the broader council, a collection of nobles whose political interests were inevitably their own, who competed for influence over the young king. Of purpose depended entirely on the external threat from France providing. As soon as the French situation began to deteriorate, the council's internal conflicts became more visible and more damaging. The coronations. Henry VI was formally crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey on November 6, 1400. He could not fully understand. The French coronation was more complicated. At exactly the moment Henry VI was being crowned in England, a French campaign was underway to crown the Dauphin Charles as the legitimate French king, a campaign being driven by a young woman from Lorraine named Joan of Arc, whose military leadership had already turned the 100 Years' War from a trajectory of English dominance into something much more uncertain. Joan of Arc had raised the Siege of Orleans in 1429, a siege that had been English strategy in France. Campaigns had cleared the route to Reims, the traditional site of French, and on July 17, 1000, the Dauphin was crowned the 7th of France at Reims with Joan of Arc. The English response was to as King of France, which they did at Notre Dame December 16, 1431. He was 11 years old. He was crowned in a foreign city, in a foreign language, country in which he had no real support outside of English military occupation. The contrast 7th coronation at Reims, with French popular support, weight of continuity, was understood to be politically significant at the time. child being crowned in Paris, as a French king being crowned, and the French people who had to choose between claims generally recognized the difference. Joan of Arc's capture and execution. Joan of Arc was captured by Burgundian forces in May 1430 and sold to the English. She was tried by an ecclesiastical court at Rouen, convicted of heresy, specifically of the heresy of wearing men's clothing, which was treated as evidence of demonic inspiration, and burned at the stake on May 30, 1431. Henry VI was 11 years old at the time of Joan's execution and was in France during this period. Whether he was aware of the trial and its proceedings, or what he understood of it if he was, is not documented. What is documented is that the execution of Joan of Arc did not restore the military momentum the English had lost since Orleans. The tide had turned, and burning one woman could not reverse it. Part 3. The personal rule, what Henry VI actually was. Henry VI assumed personal rule in approximately 1437, when he was 16 years old, and the Regency Council judged him sufficiently mature to govern. The transition was not accompanied by any noticeable change in his behavior or capacity. He had been nominally present in governmental proceedings for years, and his actual contribution to decision had been minimal. What became clear as Henry VI began to exercise personal rule was that he was, in the most genuine sense, unsuited for the specific demands of medieval kingship, as his era understood it. He was deeply religious, not performatively, but genuinely, in the way that shapes a person's entire framework for understanding experience. He founded Eton College in 1440 and King's College in 1400. Educational institutions that survive to this day present the most lasting positive achievement of his reign. His motivations were specifically educational and religious. He wanted to create centers of learning and piety, not monuments to royal power. He was personally gentle. Contemporary accounts describe him as mild, forgiving, reluctant to punish, inclined toward mercy rather than severity. These are admirable personal qualities. They are not the qualities that medieval political culture required of a king, who needed to manage factional conflict, impose discipline on powerful nobles, and project the personal authority that deterred challenges to royal power. He was not, apparently, a warrior. This was perhaps the single most critical deficiency for a medieval king, whose most pressing problem was a war in France that was going badly. Henry V had been defined by his military prowess. It was what had given him the credibility to it. Henry VI had no battlefield experience, and no apparent inclination to acquire either. The marriage to Margaret of Anjou. In 1005, Henry VI married a French princess who was, in all mention of political and personal character, where Henry was gentle, Margaret was fierce. Where Henry was indecisive, Margaret was determined. Where Henry was inclined to peace, Margaret was inclined to fight. The match was arranged partly as a diplomatic concession to France and was deeply unpopular in England, primarily because it involved the surrender of Maine and Anjou territories that the English had held. Under the terms of the treaties that ended various phases of the 100 Years' War. The surrender was arranged by Henry's chief minister, William de la Pole, Earl of. He was not. This arrangement worked tolerably in peacetime, but became deeply problematic once the political environment became sufficiently dangerous, because it created a situation in which a queen was exercising political influence that English political culture had not designed for and was not comfortable with, and that gave her enemies, when she acquired them, an obvious target. Part 4. The Collapse, 1453, and the Unraveling, the specific crisis that shattered whatever fragile equilibrium Henry VI's reign had maintained occurred in the summer of 1453, and it came from two directions simultaneously. The loss of France. The Battle of Castillon, fought on July 7, 1453, major engagement of the 100 Years' War. English and Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, distinguished English commander of the era by French artillery in an engagement approximately an hour. Talbot himself was killed. Losses were catastrophic. Castillon did not simply lose a battle. It lost a war that had been ongoing for more than a century, and that had been the central project of English foreign policy for 4 generations. Every territorial gain that Edward III had made, every gain that Henry V had made, every piece of France that the Treaty of Troyes had nominally given to the English crown, all of it was gone, with the exception of coastal holdings that would gradually diminish century. England had spent enormous treasure lives and enormous political project of maintaining English France. It had failed completely, required an explanation, and the culture immediately reached the king, Henry VI. The news of Castillon reached in approximately August 1000. His reaction was not anger or determination to rally. His simply stop functioning. Contemporary account Henry VI falling into a catatonic state, unable to recognize people, or unable to process external reality in any meaningful way, or lay in this condition for approximately 18 months, unable to participate in governance, unable to receive visitors, unable to perform any of the symbolic or practical functions of kingship. The specific nature of this breakdown has been the subject of medical and historical speculation for centuries. The most commonly proposed explanation connects it to the hereditary mental illness of his maternal grandfather, Charles VI of France, who had suffered from episodic psychosis throughout his life, including periods in which he did not recognize his own family and believed he was made of glass. The pattern of Henry VI's breakdown, episodic with eventual partial recovery, is broadly consistent with what modern psychiatry would describe as a severe depressive or schizophrenic episode. The timing was nil. Henry VI had been managing a failing military situation, a conflict at court, and the political consequences of unpopular diplomatic decisions for years, under conditions of stress that would have taxed a psychologically robust individual. The news of Castillon appears to have been the specific trigger that broke through whatever coping mechanisms he had maintained. The birth of Edward of Westminster. In October 1453, while Henry VI was in his catatonic state, Margaret of Anjou gave birth to Edward of Westminster. The timing was explosive. Henry VI was incapacitated, Richard, Duke of York, was serving as lord, and the question of the regency for the king was a factional conflict. The birth of an heir complicated everything. It potentially displaced York's claim to succeed Henry VI if he died without children, which was the ultimate prize that the Yorkist faction was positioning for. Henry VI, when he eventually emerged from his catatonic state in approximately January 1455, reportedly did not respond to the presentation of his son with any recognition or apparent emotion, as though he did not understand who the child was or what the moment signified. Whether this account is accurate or represents partisan embellishment is impossible to determine, but its political function, suggesting that the prince was not Henry's son, is obvious. Part 5. The Wars of the Roses, England's 30-year crisis. The Wars of the Roses, the civil conflict between the Lancastrian house, descended from John of Gaunt, son of Edward III, and the Yorkist house, descended from Edward III through a different line, is one of the most complex and most mythologized conflicts in English history. Understanding it requires separating the actual sequence of events from the dynastic narrative that was constructed around them after the fact. The conflict was not, in its origins, simply about rival claims to the throne. It was about the specific failure of Henry VI's kingship to maintain the political order that medieval monarchy was supposed to provide. Richard, Duke of York's first period as Lord Protector was not a power grab. It was a response to a genuine governmental crisis, a king who was unable to function, and a vacuum that someone had to fill. The conflict became a dynastic war because the specific question of who would exercise power in Henry VI's name inevitably raised the question of what happened if Henry VI's direct line failed, and because once the factional conflict escalated to the point of military confrontation, the deaths that resulted created grievances that made political resolution increasingly difficult. The First Battle of St. Albans, the first military engagement of the conflict, occurred on May 22, 1455 at St. Albans, a market town north of London where Henry VI and the royal court had been located. Richard, Duke of York, with Warwick and Salisbury, had been excluded from the council and was marching on London with military force. When the confrontation occurred, it was a street fight rather than a formal battle. The Yorkists attacked the town directly, the Lancastrian forces were caught unprepared, and Henry VI himself was captured after being wounded by an arrow. The capture of the king at the First Battle of St. Albans is the moment at which the Wars of the Roses became, irrevocably, something more than a political dispute. A king had been captured in battle by his own subjects, by men who maintained, technically, that they were fighting for the king rather than against him, but whose actions spoke more clearly than their stated intentions. Henry VI was physically injured. An arrow struck him in the neck, a wound that was not serious, but that was humiliating. He was found, according to one account, sheltering in a tanner's house in the town, abandoned by most of his attendants. He was then, in the most theatrical possible demonstration of Yorkist power, brought out and recrowned, symbolically restored to authority by the men who had just defeated his forces, in a display that made his dependence on them unmistakable. The Act of Accord, the political settlement reached in 1460, known as the Act of Accord, represents one of the more remarkable compromises in medieval English political history, and one that satisfied essentially no one while managing to provide a framework that held briefly before collapsing into the most violent phase of the conflict. Under the Act of Accord, Henry VI would remain king for his natural life, but the right of succession would pass to Richard, Duke of York, and his heirs, bypassing Edward of Westminster, Henry's own son, entirely. Henry VI accepted this arrangement. Margaret of Anjou did not. The specific legal and moral problem with the Act of Accord was exactly what Margaret of Anjou said it was. It disinherited her son, who had done nothing wrong, in favor of a political settlement that was essentially forced on an incapacitated king by the people who had just defeated him militarily. The arrangement had the form of legality without the substance of genuine consent, and Margaret's refusal to accept it was not simply personal ambition. It was a mother refusing to accept the disinheritance of her child. The Battle of Wakefield. Richard, Duke of York, died at the Battle of Wakefield on December 30, 1460. The engagement was a tactical disaster for the Yorkists. Duke Richard engaged a larger Lancastrian force from an indefensible position and was killed, along with his second son Edmund, Earl of Rutland. Richard's head was placed on the gates of the city of York with a paper crown, a deliberate mockery of his royal pretensions. The death of Richard, Duke of York, transformed the conflict. His son Edward, 18 years old, became the heir to the Yorkist claim, and immediately demonstrated that he had inherited none of his father's political caution, and rather more than his military talent. The Battle of Towton. The fought on March 29, 1461, was the largest and most brutal engagement of the Wars of the Roses, and is generally considered the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. Fought in a snowstorm, on Palm Sunday, in terrain that offered no natural advantage to either side. Towton lasted for hours and resulted in an estimated 20 deaths, a staggering figure that represented a significant fraction of England's military-age male population. The specific circumstances of Towton were particularly lethal. Edward IV had given orders, according to the chronicles, that no quarter should be given, that the normal conventions of chivalric warfare that permitted surrender and ransoming would not apply. Whether this instruction was actually given or represents retrospective explanation for the scale of the killing is debated among historians, but the outcome, a field covered with tens of thousands of dead, with relatively few prisoners taken, is consistent with an engagement in which the normal rules of medieval combat were not being observed. After Towton, Henry VI and Margaret fled with their son to Scotland, seeking protection from James III. Became king. Henry VI became a fugitive. Part 6. The Tower Years. What captivity does to a mind already fragile. Henry VI spent the years between 1465 and 1470 as a prisoner in the Tower of London, following his capture in Lancashire in 1465, wandering alone, apparently, through the north of England, until his own supporters delivered him to his enemies to secure rewards or avoid punishment. The Tower of London in the 15th century was not a dungeon in the conventional sense. High-status prisoners were housed in relative comfort, adequate food, servants, reasonable physical accommodation. Henry VI was a king, however fallen, and his treatment reflected that status in its material dimensions. What the Tower could not provide was meaningful human connection, intellectual stimulation, or any sense of purposeful activity. Henry VI was a man whose defining characteristics were piety and learning. He had founded 2 educational institutions and had spent his adult life in the company of scholars, clergymen, and courtiers. The Tower reduced his world to a set of rooms and a small number of attendants. The accounts of Henry VI's mental state during this period describe someone who had largely retreated from the external world, who spent his time in prayer and religious contemplation, who showed little interest in the political situation that had produced his captivity, and who received occasional visitors with a mild, forgiving equanimity that observers found both admirable and slightly unnerving. When Edward IV's courier, Richard Whittington, reportedly visited Henry VI in the Tower, Henry greeted him that he was at ease where he was, since Edward IV managed the kingdom better than he had done. Whether this exchange is accurately reported or represents later embellishment, it captures something essential about how Henry VI appears in the accounts of this period. Not bitter, not striving, simply present in whatever circumstances he found himself, filtered through the religious framework that organized his experience of everything. The readaption. In 1470, the extraordinary happened. Henry VI was restored to his throne. The mechanism was the falling out between Edward IV and his most powerful ally, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the man history calls the Kingmaker. Warwick had helped put Edward IV on the throne and had expected to be the dominant figure in the new regime. Edward IV's secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville in 1464, a widow from the Lancastrian side, without significant political connections, chosen apparently for personal reasons, had offended Warwick and disrupted his plans to use Edward's marriage as a diplomatic instrument. Warwick's subsequent negotiations with Margaret of Anjou, the woman he had been fighting for a decade, represented one of the more remarkable political pivots of the period. The two hated each other, had every reason to distrust each other, and needed each other. Warwick needed a cause. Margaret needed a military commander. The alliance was sealed with the betrothal of Warwick's daughter Anne to Edward of Westminster, Henry VI's son, a dynastic tie that made both parties' interests align, at least temporarily. The subsequent invasion drove Edward IV into exile and restored Henry VI to the throne on October 3, 1470. The restoration was known as the readaption, a term derived from the legal concept of readoption, reassumption of office. Henry VI's readaption government was Warwick's government. Henry VI was present in it as a symbol, paraded through the streets of London to demonstrate that the Lancastrian king was alive and restored, but making no meaningful political decisions and apparently uninterested in making any. Contemporary accounts of his public appearances describe a man who was tired, slow, and visibly diminished from the figure who had last been seen publicly before his imprisonment. The readaption lasted 6 months. Part 7. The final year, Barnet, Tewkesbury, and the Tower. Edward IV returned to England in March 1471 with a small army and the determination to recover his throne. He landed in Yorkshire, where local Yorkist sympathies gave him an initial base, and marched south, gathering forces as he went. The Battle of Barnet. The Battle of Barnet, fought on April 14, 1471, was decisive in a way that went beyond the military outcome. Warwick, the Kingmaker, the man who had been the dominant military figure in English politics for 15 years, the architect of both Edward IV's original rise and Henry VI's brief restoration, was killed in the fighting. The fog that hung over the battlefield contributed to a catastrophic friendly fire incident in which Lancastrian forces attacked each other, believing they were engaged with the enemy. Warwick's death removed the only military commander capable of effectively opposing Edward IV. Henry VI, receiving Edward IV in the Tower after his return to London, reportedly greeted him warmly. The accounts suggest he had either no understanding of the political reality or a complete resignation to it. That produced the same behavioral result. The Battle of Tewkesbury. Margaret of Anjou, who had landed in England the same day as the Battle of Barnet without knowing its outcome, continued her campaign after learning of Warwick's death. The Battle of Tewkesbury, fought on May 4, 1471, was her last hope. Edward of Westminster, Henry VI's 17-year-old son, the Prince of Wales, the heir whose existence had been the central justification for the Lancastrian cause throughout the conflict, was killed in the battle. The circumstances of his death are unclear. Some accounts say he was killed in the fighting, others that he was captured and then executed after surrender. The specific circumstances are less important than the consequence. With his death, the direct Lancastrian line ended. Margaret of Anjou was captured. She eventually returned to France, dying there in 1482. a decade after the destruction of everything she had spent her life fighting for. Henry VI's death. Henry VI died in the Tower of London on the night of May 21 to 22, 1471. He was 50 years old. The official Yorkist account attributed his death to grief upon learning of his son's death at Tewkesbury, a natural death of sorrow rather than violence. The Lancastrian tradition held that he was murdered, almost certainly by order of Edward IV, to remove the possibility of his serving again as a rallying point for Lancastrian resistance. Modern historians generally favor the murder explanation, for the simple reason that Henry VI's death was extraordinarily convenient for Edward IV, occurring at exactly the moment when the Lancastrian cause needed to be eliminated permanently rather than merely suppressed temporarily. A man in reasonable physical health who dies suddenly at age 50, at a politically convenient moment, in a facility controlled by his political enemies, without any documented illness preceding the death. The balance of probability points toward violence rather than coincidence. No autopsy, in any modern meaningful sense, was performed. No investigation was conducted. The body was briefly displayed publicly, the traditional way of demonstrating that the death was real. And then Henry VI was buried at Chertsey Abbey, later moved to St. George's Chapel, Windsor. Part 8. What Henry VI founded, Eton and King's College. The most lasting achievement of Henry VI's reign has nothing to do with politics or war. It is two educational institutions that survive as living institutions more than 5 centuries after his death. Eton College. Eton College was founded by Henry VI in 1440, chartered as the King's College of Our Lady of Eton, beside Windsor. The foundation document specified a school for 70 poor scholars to be educated free of charge. An educational charity in the medieval model, endowed with sufficient land and revenue to support itself in perpetuity. The choice of 70 scholars was deliberate and symbolic. It reflected the 70 disciples sent out the Gospel of Luke, connecting the foundation explicitly to the model of Christian educational charity rather than to the model of royal patronage for its own sake. Religious motivations for the founding. He wanted to create a community that would pray for his souls of his predecessors, while receiving the education that he genuinely believed was transformative. Survived every political change since 1400, the wars of the Rose Dynasty, the Civil War, the social 20th century, was sufficient, its institutional established, and because each found it more useful to maintain a functioning institution than to disrupt it. It is now one of the most famous schools in the world. 19 British Prime Ministers attended it. King's College, Cambridge. King's College, Cambridge was founded in 1441 as the companion institution to Eton, the university college to which Eton's scholars would proceed. Henry VI's original vision was for a college of 70 scholars, mirroring Eton, whose members would be drawn exclusively from Eton's roll. The most visible physical legacy of King's College is its chapel, begun under Henry VI in 1446, completed under Henry VIII in 1515, and representing the most complete surviving example of perpendicular Gothic architecture in England. The chapel's fan vaulting is among the fine medieval stone construction in the world. Its Rubens altarpiece, its wooden choir screen, and its acoustics, which have made it the setting for the Festival of 9 Lessons and Carols, broadcast worldwide every Christmas Eve since 1928, have given King's College Chapel a cultural significance that extends far beyond its academic function. Henry VI laid the foundation stone himself and left detailed notes about the chapel's intended design. Notes that survive in the archives and that show a man with genuine aesthetic vision, not simply a patron handing over money and leaving the details to others. That the buildings of these foundations, buildings that Henry VI designed, funded, and cared about, in ways that no purely political project in his reign could command, have outlasted every political consequence of his reign, is one of the more poignant ironies in English architectural history. Part 9. The Owen Tudor Question: How Henry VI Changed the Succession. Discussed, but historically consequential decisions of Henry was his response to the secret marriage of his mother, Catherine of Valois, to Owen Tudor. Catherine of Valois was Henry VI's mother. After Henry V's death in 1422, she was a young widow in her 20s, wealthy, politically prominent, and in a legal position that was genuinely unusual. English law and custom had no established framework for dowager queens. Their status, their freedom of movement, and their right to remarry were all ambiguous. She met Owen Tudor, a Welsh gentleman who served in her household, at some point in the mid-1420. The relationship that developed between them was conducted secretly for years. At some point they married, though the precise date and circumstances are not documented. Between approximately 1430 and 1436, they had 4 children: Edmund, Jasper, Owen, and a daughter who died young. The marriage became known to the council in approximately 1436. Owen Tudor was arrested and interrogated. Catherine of Valois died in January 1437. The circumstances of her death remain somewhat unclear, though she had been in ill health for some time. Owen Tudor was eventually released without serious punishment. Henry VI's response to discovering that he had half-siblings of unknown legal status, children of his mother and a Welsh gentleman, born outside any formal recognition, with no rather than treating his half-brothers as a political embarrassment to be managed or suppressed. He incorporated them into the royal household and eventually gave them significant titles. Edmund Tudor became Earl of Richmond, became Earl of Pembroke. The long consequence: this decision, made from what appears to be simple affection for his half-brothers rather than any political calculation, would ultimately determine the succession to the English throne. Edmund Tudor married Margaret Beaufort in 1455. Margaret Beaufort was 14 years old. Edmund Tudor was approximately 24. Edmund died in November 1456, 3 months after the marriage, of plague, having barely had time to establish his household, let alone his dynasty. His wife was pregnant at the time of his death. On January 28, 1457, in Pembroke Castle, under the protection of Jasper Tudor, Margaret Beaufort gave birth to a son. The birth was difficult. Margaret was 13 years old and physically not fully mature, and the labor was dangerous and the child were fortunate to survive. The child's name was Henry Tudor. In 1485, Henry Tudor landed in Wales, marched through England gathering support, and defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. He became Henry VII, the first Tudor monarch, founding the dynasty that would include Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. Henry VII was the son of Edmund Tudor and Margaret Beaufort. He was the grandson of Owen Tudor and Catherine of Valois. He was able to claim the throne partly through his mother's Beaufort descent, which connected him to the Lancaster line of the Plantagenets. All of this was made possible, in the first instance, by Henry VI's decision to embrace his half-brothers rather than suppress them. Edmund Tudor would not have become Earl of Richmond without Henry VI's patronage. He would not have been in a position to marry Margaret Beaufort. Henry VII would not have been born. The king, who failed at almost everything within his direct control, enabled through an act of simple human kindness, the dynasty that replaced the one that destroyed him. Part 10. The posthumous rehabilitation, saint or failure. Henry VI was never officially canonized by the Catholic Church, but he came remarkably close. In the decades following his death, a cult of devotion to Henry VI developed spontaneously, centered on his tomb at Chertsey Abbey and later at Windsor, in which he was credited with miracles, visited by pilgrims, and treated with the informal reverence that the medieval church recognized as the popular precursor to formal canonization. Henry VII, who had obvious political reasons for rehabilitating the reputation of his great-uncle, since associating the Tudor dynasty with a royal saint would strengthen its legitimacy, actively promoted the canonization cause. He had Henry VI's remains moved from Chertsey to the more prestigious St. George's Chapel at Windsor, commissioning an elaborate tomb. He petitioned Rome for canonization on multiple occasions. The canonization ultimately did not proceed. The disruptions of the Reformation, and specifically the break with Rome under Henry VIII, made the matter moot, since an English monarch seeking papal canonization of his royal ancestor was no longer making sense within the new ecclesiastical framework. But the cult itself is historically significant. The people who visited Henry VI's tomb and reported miracles were not, in most cases, sophisticated political actors responding to Tudor propaganda. They were ordinary people who had a specific sense of what Henry VI had been, not a failed king, but a holy man placed in an impossible position, whose specific qualities of gentleness and forgiveness were precisely the qualities that the brutal political environment of the Wars of the Roses had punished most severely. The medieval theological framework treated the innocent suffering of the virtuous as particularly efficacious in intercession. The person who suffers unjustly has a specific closeness to Christ's own suffering that gives their prayers particular weight. Henry VI in this framework was not simply a failed king to be pitied. He was a man whose suffering had made him holy. Whether one accepts the theological framework or not, the popular response to Henry VI after his death reveals something important about how he was actually perceived by the people who had lived through his reign, not as a villain, not as a mere incompetent. As someone who had been given an impossible task and who had carried it with a kind of grace, impractical, sometimes disastrous in its consequences, but recognizably genuine. Henry VI was not a bad king, in the sense of being cruel, corrupt, or indifferent to the welfare of his subjects. He was a bad king, in the sense of being temperamentally unsuited to the specific demands of medieval monarchy, at the specific historical moment in which he was required to exercise it. He was a scholar placed in a soldier's position. He was a man of peace placed in the center of the longest war in English history. He was a person whose natural inclination was toward forgiveness, placed in a political environment where the failure to destroy enemies reliably produced enemies who destroyed him. He founded Eton. He founded King's College. He embraced his half-brothers with a generosity that inadvertently produced the Tudor dynasty. He endured captivity, mental breakdown, and the death of his son with an equanimity that observers found remarkable. He greeted the man who imprisoned him with apparent warmth, and he died in a tower, probably murdered by order of the king he had just welcomed. The historical tradition that treats him as one of England's worst kings is not wrong about the outcomes of his reign. It is wrong about what those outcomes tell us. Henry VI did not fail England. He was failed by a system that placed him in a position no person with his specific qualities could have managed, and then held him responsible for the consequences. That distinction between personal failure and systematic failure is one that history rarely makes carefully enough. Henry VI was King of England for 49 years, across 2 separate reigns, longer than almost any English monarch. He left behind 2 of England's most distinguished educational institutions. He left behind, through the chain of events his generosity set in motion, the dynasty that produced Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. He was the most unlucky king in English history. He may also have been one of its better human beings. The detail that I keep returning to in Henry, the 6th story, is the founding of Eton and King's College. Here is a king who was failing catastrophically at almost everything that medieval kingship required. He was losing a war that had been going on for a century. He was watching his country slide towards civil conflict that would eventually produce some of the bloodiest battles in English history. He was surrounded by men whose political ambitions he could not manage and whose loyalty he could not secure. And in the middle of all of this, in 1440 and 1441, he sat down and designed 2 schools. Not monuments to his own power, not military fortifications or diplomatic gifts to foreign courts. Schools, institutions whose specific purpose was to educate people who couldn't afford education. Organized logical model that connected scholarship to prayer and prayer to the welfare of the community. The specific detail that reveals his genuine engagement with the project is that he left notes. Detailed notes about the chapel at King's College, its dimensions, its design, the specific quality of the stone, the acoustics he wanted it to have. These are not the instructions of a patron handing over money and moving on. They are the notes of someone who cared about the thing they were creating, who had thought about it carefully, who wanted the result to reflect something specific.